started.
I'm seeing some familiar faces in there. Some people working on beehives. I can see Tom Whitburn. That's exciting. There you go. Extracting honey while watching a class on bees. How cool is that?
Let's see. Great, so we're going to get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Beekeeping with Dan Carr at Beavertides Farm. I'm Meg Scher. I'm the Assistant Director of the DM Hunt Library, and I'm excited to get to introduce my friend Dan. Dan started keeping bees as a Peace Corps volunteer in Malawi, where he served for 3 years as an agricultural volunteer. He came back from the Peace Corps in 2010 and started working at Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, where he was the livestock assistant manager and beekeeper for 5 years, and where he started teaching beekeeping classes. In 2014, he met his wife Marlene while teaching a beekeeping course on a rooftop farm in Brooklyn. And a year later, Dan and Marlene moved to the northwestern corner of Connecticut to start Beavertides Farm. Beavertides Farm is a sustainable livestock farm where Marlene and Dan raise sheep, goats, 1 million honeybees, and 2 very cute little boys. Besides raising livestock for meat, they offer courses and other gatherings for people to learn about sustainable farming and homesteading while connecting with others and nature outside in a safe way. In April starts their 10-session beekeeping training course, which teaches people everything they need to know to be able to manage their own beehives. Each session is 2.5 hours and consists of outdoor classroom time, as well as hands-on time in the apiary with Dan. Besides that, Dan and Marlene offer classes on raising your own chickens, beekeeping for kids, and weekly pasture walks on their farm. You can find more information at beavertidesfarm.com. Thanks, Dan, for sharing your knowledge with us. The Hunt Library is committed to providing a wide range of free educational programs. Your support is always appreciated. To make a donation, you can visit the library's website, huntlibrary.org/support. Both the link to Beavertides Farm and the link to donate will be posted in the chat. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat and Dan will answer them at the end. Thanks a lot for coming. I'm going to hand it over to Dan.
Thanks a lot, Meg. And thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces and to see so many people coming to hear more about bees. But a big thank you to David Hunt Library. Please do, if you know, it's wonderful, all the free content that they share. Our 5-year-old and 2-year-old are big fans of Story Hour every Tuesday and Thursday at the library. So it's really a wonderful institution here in our community. So if you're able to, please do donate to them. And thanks again for giving me this platform. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Bear with me for one moment. Oh, I don't think that actually worked. There we go. Can anybody see my screen yet? Meg, or let's see. There we go. And there. And all right, now we can see my screen, right? Give me a thumbs up if we can see, if you can all see my screen. Good, okay. So this is just a brief introduction to beekeeping. And let me get rid of that guy. Oops. Sorry, one second. Not now. Let me go back to that. Okay, so this is meant to be basically a brief overview. Obviously, in 45 minutes to an hour, we're not going to be able to get you ready to start your own beehives, but this is kind of a primer. I want to want to sort of whet your appetite and get you excited about beekeeping. And then hopefully that'll lead you to seeking other avenues. And there's plenty of them out there. One is our website, which you can see here, beavertidesfarm.com. You can go there and you can sign up for that 10-part beekeeping class that Meg mentioned in the intro. But also, you know, there's countless great beekeepers associations and organizations out there. I'll give a free plug for anybody that's in New York City. Tom Whitburn, who's on this call or in this group, he's leads Best Bees in New York City. They keep hives for people all around the city and also in the suburbs of New York City, and as well as Boston, if there happens to be any Bostonians here. But Tom heads up the New York City branch. So, and if there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to us through the website, or you know, after this you can reach out through our website. But for now, if you do have questions along the way, just go ahead and post them in the chat, and I'll try and get to them all at the end. Just a quick overview of how I got into beekeeping. My introduction to beekeeping was as a Peace Corps volunteer in East Africa, in the northern region of the small country Malawi. My introduction was mostly through this man up here in the left-hand corner. His name is Bwana Mazito. He was my first mentor in beekeeping, and we kept hives all along the Waza Game Preserve's border between the village we lived in, Mzisi, and the game preserve. And that was a wonderful introduction. It was, you know, this was Apis mellifera scutellata, the African honeybee, which is far more defensive than some of our European breeds. So I really got good at getting suited up to go into the beehives. Not at all what you see here on the right, with me and my wife not wearing much protection at all, much protective equipment at all. But I from the Peace Corps, as Meg said, I started working at stone barns, and I started teaching classes in New York City. That's where I met my beautiful wife, Marlene, and then we moved up to Beavertides together to start our own farm here in Falls Village, Connecticut. And it's beekeeping's really been a cornerstone of our farm from the very beginning. So we're really happy to be able to share our joy for honeybees along the way. So to start off with, I know you're all on mute, but I want to start it off with a question. And maybe Tom is excluded from being able to answer this question, but to everybody else, how much would you guess in one honeybee's lifetime, how much honey does one honeybee produce in her entire lifetime? Any guesses? And you can, I don't know if you're able to take off your mute, but you're welcome to unmute yourself and shout out a guess if you have one. Any guesses? Let's see. Oh, I'm gonna go to the chat. 1 gallon. No, way less than that. One honeybee in her whole lifetime is going to be a lot less than that. Let's actually think in terms of teaspoons. Yeah, there you go. Teaspoon. Less than a teaspoon. Less than 1 teaspoon. And you want to guess a percentage of a teaspoon? 1/10. That's a good guess. 1 dram. I don't know what a dram is. I'll go ahead and tell you, it's 1/12 of a teaspoon. In a honeybee's lifetime, a worker bee, she'll live about 12 weeks in throughout her whole life cycle. I'm sorry, about 6 weeks in the growing season. And that whole 6-week period, she's only going to produce about 1/12 of a teaspoon in that time. So think about that. The next time you put a teaspoon of honey in your coffee or tea, that's 12 honeybees' entire lives that went into producing that. But you know, despite that, a colony of honeybees working together over the course of the year, you know, 40 to 60,000 worker bees working together will produce an abundance of 200 pounds of honey in a single season. So in a really good year when the conditions are right. So that, you know, to me, that's the ultimate example of a community of selfless individuals working for a greater good. And it's things like that the more I learn about bees, and I learn about bees every year still, the more I find them endlessly fascinating and just a joy and wonderful. So the primary question that I get from people when they find out I'm a beekeeper is, what do I need to be able to keep my own hive? So that's basically what we're going to go through in this whole session here. To be able to keep your own hive, you need the right space for it, you need the right materials, and the right knowledge or skills. So we're going to go over those in broad categories, starting with the right space. So, you know, this is an apiary in Sharon that I kept, and here you can already see in this picture a diversity of pollen and nectar sources because of the variety of different trees. We're in pasture, so there's dandelions, clover. That's, to me, one of the #1 things to think about. And even if you live in New York City like Tom does, I mean, you have so many wonderful flowering trees in New York City, you know, from the black locusts to the lindens, and then along the wetlands, willows, and all sorts of different nectar sources, even in the city. So, and we want to think about where our bees are going to travel, and that's going to be, it can be as much as 3 miles in any direction. But ideally, you want to put your apiary in a place that is has nectar and pollen sources, an abundance of a diversity of nectar and pollen sources that are going to be blooming throughout the whole growing season. As close as possible, you know, within a quarter mile if possible. Safe from pesticides. That's another thing to think about when you're thinking about where your nectar and pollen sources are. You really have to consider, are the majority of your nectar and pollen sources in a place where a lot of pesticides are being used, like golf courses, or you know, certain agricultural fields are going to have much more pesticides, and even things like herbicides, like, you know, Roundup, I generally try to avoid, even though they might not be directly toxic to the honeybees. A lot of these herbicides and even fungicides are fat soluble, so the bees will pick them up when they're collecting nectar and pollen, and over time they will build up in the beeswax. And you know, the beeswax is a lipid, so if these pesticides are fat soluble, you're going to get a variety over time of different agrochemicals potentially building up, and they can synergize and make more dangerous compounds over time. So that's an argument for, you know, changing out your bee comb in your hive, but it's also it's something to just consider. You know, try and think about, you know, what pesticides might be used in your area. One thing you'll see behind me in this picture, you can see those white lines, and there's T-posts all along the way. That's actually a bear fence. That's actually a 9-foot high bear fence. And all those white wires are electrified. So ideally, you need some sort of a bare fence wherever you're going to keep your bees. Oh, yeah, I see Barbara just commented around here. How can we be sure it's safe from bears? Electricity is your best bet. And it doesn't need to be a very elaborate fence like the one that I put up here. You can go to websites like Premier One or you know, even go to Ken Cove or places like that and get netting, electric netting and solar fence energizers, so that you can really set up your fence anywhere. So you can set up a net around your fence, and as long as you keep it, you know, the grass from growing up over it, that makes pretty good protection for your bees. I make sure that it's really good and hot, especially at the beginning. And I'll oftentimes bait that fence. That if I'm putting up a new apiary and it's a brand new bear fence, I'm going to put bacon right on that bear fence, so that if a bear does walk by, they're going to get a shock right on the muzzle, and that's going to teach that bear. Usually, it's the same bear that's going to be patrolling the same area. I'm going to make sure that that bear knows this is not the place for them to come, and they know to steer clear. I also want to be cognizant of where people traffic is. And you'd be surprised, you know, like Tom, I've kept bees in New York City, and I've kept them, you know, right across the street from Sunset Park, where there's, you know, thousands of people every day. But I had them up, you know, on a 2-story building, not very high. You know, people could actually see the beehives from the street, but the entrance was well above where the people traffic was. And that's really what's key. You want to make sure that, you know, the entrances are not going to be where the majority of people are. So if you're putting your beehives, you know, near a place where people might be, I wouldn't put it within 20 or 30 feet of where people are going to be, but just turn it so that the entrance is facing away from where those people are going to be, and that makes a big difference just in doing that. Good sun is actually great for bees. People are always saying, you know, do I need to give a little shade to my bees? You know, honeybees do great in full sun. Maybe not if you're putting them on a rooftop and it, you know, they're on all black tar. You don't want it to be, you know, in full sun all the time. But generally, you know, I think the more sun, the better. Bees do great in the sun. Varroa mites, one of their main pests, do not do so great in the sun. And you want to really make sure it's accessible year round. You don't want to have it be in a place that might have be flooded in the spring, or in the winter time is going to be inaccessible. You want to be able to get to your bees, make sure that on those warm days they're able to get out and go out on their cleansing flights even in the middle of the winter. And I ideally want to have it someplace where I can get a truck, so that, you know, when it's honey harvest time, you know, a box, a medium box of honey frames can be 40 to 50 pounds. So, you know, you don't want to be hauling all those heavy boxes out without being able to get your vehicle in there. So right materials. Well, you know, one of the most important materials is the bees themselves. So how do we get our bees? There's 2 main ways people get honeybees. A package of bees, so usually a 3 to 4 pound package of bees that you can see this gentleman holding here. In the center of that is a cage with a queen. And on top of that is actually a tin can full of sugar syrup. So these bees can be transported from their source, whether it's California or Georgia, and then be brought to be installed into a hive. the advantages, well, and then the other option would be a nuke or a nucleus colony. I'm sure the NSA has been tracking me since I'm constantly texting or calling asking for nukes, but that has nothing to do with nuclear. That's a nucleus colony, which is generally 4 or 5 frames that already have drawn out comb. So it's the frames that are ready to put right into your hive, and the queen's already laying there. So it gets a really fast start. It's usually the way bees are sold when you're buying bees locally. You'll usually buy a nuke. But some people will even produce local packages as well. But generally, if you're buying locally, it'll be a nuke. If you're buying from a warmer climate where their bees have had more time to grow, you're gonna generally get a package. Advantage of packages is there's less chance for disease. There a lot of the diseases that bees can transmit are in the brood or the comb. There's when you have a package of bees too, you can drizzle oxalic acid, which is an organic acid, over them in a very low concentration, and that will make sure that they don't have any of those parasites, or it'll greatly reduce the parasite load of varroa mites, that parasite I mentioned before. The advantage of nukes is generally you get a much faster start. The queen's already laying and they're ready to take off. You put those 5 frames in the box and then they're ready to start growing and taking off. So you got, also packages tend to be much less expensive. They're more in the range of $125 to $150 this year. And nukes tend to be closer to $200, $250. So it's all, there's all those different things to weigh out. The other primary material you need is your hive itself. I'm just going to talk about the Langstroth Hive, which is a standard hive that most people use in North America. There's also top bar hives or Warre hives, which are great. But I would say for beginners, it's good to start off with Langstroth. It's a much easier hive to get started with. It's much more difficult to get going with a top bar hive because they don't tend to overwinter as well in this northern climate. They're wonderful for the tropics. And they can be wonderful for beekeepers here as well, but I recommend maybe starting with the Langstroth. So you have the option of 8 frame or a 10 frame hive. 8 frames are just 2 less frames, so they're that much lighter, especially when it's full of honey. So that's a big advantage of 8 frame. And really the 10 frame, I don't see a huge advantage to. I'm kind of old school, and I think, well, this is going to give my queen more space to lay. But really, having kept both 8 frame and 10 frame, I haven't seen any advantage for myself in keeping 10 frame hives. And somebody asked if I can spell the name of the hive. That's a Langstroth, Langstroth, Langstroth hive. And I'll put that in the chat. So you're going to need all the components you can see here. I don't know if my chat is maybe blocking that. I don't know if you guys can actually see my chat. But with a Langstroth, you have the bottom, a hive stand of some kind or another. You can purchase a hive stand. I've used just cinder blocks to get my hives up off the ground. And then on top of that hive stand, you have a bottom board. And ideally, a screened bottom board, which is good for ventilation as well as for being able to take mite counts throughout the season. And then some sort of an entrance reducer, which I'll talk more about later. And then usually on top of that, you're going to have what's called deep boxes, or the brood boxes. I recommend starting with at least 2 of those in the beginning. And then you also are going to need either shallow or medium supers. That's generally where your honey is going to be. Once your hive gets going, the bees that are generally going to want to keep their brood closer to the entrance for ventilation, and they're going to want to keep their honey farther away up towards the top. So as your bees get stronger, you're going to add more boxes. You'll start with just 1 deep box, and then you're going to have another deep box on top of that as they get stronger. And then once they get to the point where they've drawn out all of their deep boxes and they're filling it all in, I would say at least 70% of every box is full. You're gonna full of either the honey or pollen or brood, which is eggs, larvae, and pupa, which I'll talk more about in a minute. Then it's time to start adding honey supers. So that's usually your shallow or medium boxes. I prefer medium boxes, but shallows are even lighter. And then you'll start adding those up on top. And once one of those gets 70% full, you'll add another one. So I recommend starting with 2 deep boxes and 2 medium or shallow boxes as well. Right from the start, have that on hand. You don't want to be, building equipment the day before you need to add them, add them on. I generally like to paint the outside of all of my boxes to protect, sort of weatherize the boxes, protect the wood from the elements. On top of that, you're going to have an inner cover, which keeps the outer cover, which is your weather cover, from getting glued down by the bees to the top box. Another thing that, if you're ordering a hive kit of some kind from one of the beekeeping supply places, then you'll oftentimes get a queen excluder. I really recommend not using that in the first year. The problem with using a queen excluder is the bees have a really hard time drawing out the initial comb above a queen excluder. The purpose of a queen excluder is it keeps the queen in the brood nest in the deep boxes and keeps her from laying eggs in the top boxes. But in your first year, you're most likely just going to be cherry picking a few honey frames out. You're not going to be harvesting the whole box of honey, most likely. So I recommend you saving that queen excluder for the second year. Somebody asked, do you have trouble with cold temperatures with a screen bottom board? No, I don't. In fact, I want a little bit of ventilation because I don't want moisture to build up in the hive during the season. And anytime you get a screen bottom board, you get a mite count board generally with that. And once I have when I get really cold days like we had these last couple days up here, we had 15-degree nights. I keep that mite count board underneath the hive to keep it from getting cold. So good question there. So the right tools. Sorry, let me move my chat box here. The indispensable tool that every beekeeper needs is some sort of a hive tool. And from the beekeeping supply places, you'll have 2 options: a J-hook hive tool like this, or more like a paint scraper or traditional hive tool. I am happy with both. I have both on hand. The one thing I will caution, if you use a J-hook hive tool, it's easy to start to think of it as a crowbar and start really wrenching on your frames, and that's when I find that people, bees tend to glue all the frames into place using propolis, which is tree resin that the bees collect and add their own enzymes to it. So they'll be glued down. If you're wrenching at it with your J-hook hive tool, there's a good chance you might break some frames. So I prefer the paint scraper, but get both. They're like $6 each. You know, get both, see which one you're more comfortable with, and just don't wrench on your frames too hard with either one of them. Everybody's going to need some type of a feeder. I use these in-hive frame feeders, and that feeder is to feed sugar syrup. And the reason for that is, especially in the beginning, when you establish your hive, you're going to be putting empty boxes in with frames that just have a little bit of either plastic or wax foundation in it, but they don't have all that drawn out comb. And that comb is very expensive to the bees. It takes, you know, up to 10 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of wax, of that beeswax. So it's really precious stuff for them. So you really want to be able to feed 1-to-1 sugar syrup. So that's 1 part sugar by volume to 1 part water by volume. And you mix that up until the water is dissolved, and you can feed that out, and that gets them settled in right from the start, and it gets them drawing out their comb. Obviously, you're not going to want to be feeding when it's nectar flow time, and once you start putting on those honey supers, you're taking off your feeders, and you're not feeding any sugar syrup at that time. I also recommend all beekeepers have an entrance reducer. So you see on the bottom left here. And the main reason for that is to protect your bees. You know, especially when we start to get into a little bit of a dearth in the middle of the season, the yellow jackets and the various hornets are going to start coming into your hive and looking for nectar and looking for bees themselves. You know, they actually attack the bees and go for the protein in the brood. So we need to be able to reduce down that entrance during certain times of the year. Also to prevent disease, because other hives, you know, within a 3-mile radius will send some of their worker bees to rob out your worker bees. And oftentimes those robbers can come with a disease or parasites on them and introduce those disease and parasites to your hive. So even if it's a simple wood block that, you know, you make in your own wood shop, you want to be able to close down that entrance at various times. A bee brush also is great for being able to remove the bees when you're harvesting honey. Now the personal protective equipment, that's essential materials as well. And you know, I think the most essential tool for all beekeepers is a smoker. The purpose of the smoker is this masks the alarm pheromone in the hive. So bees communicate through smells mostly. So if you open up your hive, anytime you disturb your hive, even if you just knock on it, you're going to smell a little bit of a sweet smell in the hive, almost like bananas. That's the alarm pheromone. And that's the call to all the guard bees to say, hey, you know, there's some sort of a threat here. And that's when the guard bees tend to get more defensive. So we want to always have the same sort of smoker fuel. I just use white pine needles. Dried out white pine needles. Some people use baling twine. Whatever it is, use a consistent smell. You know, if you want to be really fancy with your bees, you can use like white sage or something like that. But I generally use white pine needles, and I try and keep the same smell coming out of my smoker, because to me, every time I'm working my hive, I feel like as long as I'm gentle and I'm having a net benefit on the hive, they're going to be calmer and calmer the more I work that hive. So It's almost like a knock at the door every time I give them that familiar smell of smoke. It also makes them think that there might be a fire in the area. So if you have a really defensive hive, you give a lot of smoke, and that will induce them to start to suck nectar in their bellies, which gets them in a mode where they're not even really physically capable of stinging if they're full of nectar. And it definitely slows them down, makes them a little more lethargic. So a smoker is personal protective equipment. That's the way I like to think of it. And then beyond that, a suit, I recommend getting a full suit. And unlike my son Oliver here, I recommend having some beekeeping gloves that have elastic bands, ones that'll go all the way to your elbow and have elastic bands. Will protect you from having bees going up your sleeves, and also having boots. And you may over time shed this. I almost never work with gloves now because I'm used to it, and the occasional sting is okay for me. But I always have gloves on hand in case I have a hive that's getting really, really defensive and they're getting to the point of being unworkable. Then I need to put on gloves if I have a task that I really need to accomplish. And the boots, having tall boots keeps you from having that very uncomfortable feeling of having a bee fly up your pant leg, which I can definitely attest to is a very, very uncomfortable feeling. So you want to avoid that. Next slide. So that covers the right materials, and we covered the right space. The last part is a really simple part, and that's the right knowledge. And to me, the best way to find the right knowledge is to get your hands in a hive. And I think the best way to do that is to find a mentor. As I mentioned, we have our beekeeping class, that's where this picture comes from, where people are getting to manage their own hive on our farm after we do a little PowerPoint presentation. Then everybody goes out and, whatever the topic was that week, they go out and they practice that in their own hives. So, we still have some spaces left in our class here at Beavertides. If you're in the New York City area, I know the Brooklyn Grange still has a wonderful class on their rooftop farm, and now it's taught by Courtney Epton, who is a wonderful teacher who I know really well and I think really highly of, and she's a very knowledgeable beekeeper. And then if you don't have a class in your area, or you're not able to take a class, you don't have the time to be able to commit to that, look for a local beekeepers association. Here in Connecticut, we have the Backyard Beekeepers Association in Weston, Connecticut. We also have the Connecticut Beekeepers Association, which has a roving meeting. There's always at least one meeting here in in Bethlehem, Connecticut. But the Connecticut beekeepers meet at various sites throughout the year. And there's plenty of great Facebook groups and things like that to get that knowledge. Or if you can just find a beekeeper, you have a neighbor that's a beekeeper and you say, hey, I know your time is precious, but if you can tell me when you're going into your hives and maybe I could tag along a few times, I can learn along the way. That's great too, but obviously be respectful of other people's time. Like I said, beekeepers associations are the way to go if you can. Also the Hudson Valley Beekeepers Association meets in Kingston, New York, and that's another great one. So John asked in the chat group, what is the total cost to get started? And generally you're looking at, for a starter hive, between $150 and $200. And then for the bees themselves, if you're doing a package, $125. And then equipment, you know, a suit, a full suit like the one I'm wearing in this picture is about $130. If you get a jacket veil like the ones that all the beekeepers around me are wearing, and you have good sturdy pants, that's more like $50 to $75. So we do the math. And oh, so just some quick basics of what you're going to find in the hive. I'm not sure if my chat box is in the way, please tell me in the chat. But if you guys can't see it, then that's great. So what you're gonna, I'm just gonna give you the basics of what you're gonna find in the hives. And you know, this is sort of just to sort of prime you and give you the basic knowledge, but this isn't really enough to get you started, obviously. So we have the bees themselves. We have beeswax, which they, you know, becomes their larder, or, you know, where they store their honey and their pollen. It's also their nursery. It's where they're storing their brood, the eggs, larvae, and pupa. And then you know, we have in here, you can see the liquid nectar, which is not capped yet. And then you can see the capped honey here. That's how we can tell when honey is ready to be harvested, when it's at 18% water content or less. The bees cap it off, and it's basically their way of jarring for the winter, canning for the winter. And until then, it's nectar, and that's what you can see, this open liquid down here. And then pollen, so nectar and honey is going to be their energy source, their carbohydrate source, whereas pollen is their protein source, and that's what they're using mostly for growing the larvae and pupa. So that's, you can see all the beautiful different colors from you know, a good, varied pollen source here, or multiple different pollen sources here. You got the crimson red to orange, you know, potentially dandelion pollen, to this really white pollen. So let's go through these things one by one. The bees themselves, there's 3 castes of bees. The predominant caste of bees is the worker bees. You see here on the far left. Those are infertile females. They won't lay eggs that can hatch out into workers or queens. And they make up about 95% of the hive, and they do every task from being the nurse bees that take care of the brood, to being the builder bees as they get older and they start using their wax glands, and then becoming guard bees as they develop a sting around 3 weeks old. And then eventually all of them in the last 3 weeks of their life will become foragers, going out and foraging for nectar, pollen, and honey. And we also have the drone, which is they make up you know, less than 5% of the hive generally, and they are their primary role is passing on the genetics of the hive, helping to inseminate other queens outside of their own hive. So once they reach a certain age, they're going to go out every day to drone congregation areas where they're actually drawn to the same spot with other drones, you know, up in the sky, and they're all mixing together with drones from different hives. And then when a virgin queen emerges, she's going to go flying through that drone congregation area, and the fastest and the strongest of the drones is going to mate with her. And he has a a barbed endophallus, so like a worker honeybee's stinger. So his penis will actually get stuck while mating with the queen mid-flight and rip away, killing the drone. But he served his purpose, and he sealed off those genetics in the queen. And she'll be mated by up to 20 or 30 different drones on multiple nuptial flights. And then the queen is the primary reproductive source inside the hive. She's laying up to 1,500 eggs at the height of the season in a single day. All day, every day, she's climbing around and putting her abdomen down into cells and laying a single egg in a single cell. Well, actually, before we move on from there, and the queen is generally, there's only going to be one queen in the hive. When she loses her fecundity and she's no longer laying fertilized eggs anymore, usually the workers will supersede that queen. They'll sting her, and they'll take another queen cell, or they'll take another regular worker egg, they'll draw that out and point it downwards, and that's called a queen cup. And that's a sign to everybody else. All the other cells are going horizontally, and now you have a cell that's pointing straight down, or multiple cells that are pointing straight down. Those are meant to be queens, and that's a sign to all the worker bees to feed them royal jelly. They actually produce royal jelly in a gland inside their head called the hypopharyngeal gland. And that mandibular secretion, they'll feed to those queen cells, and that's all they'll be fed their entire life. When you see these workers surrounding the queen here, they're picking up her queen pheromone to pass throughout the hive, and whenever they're feeding her that royal jelly as well throughout her entire lifetime. So when a queen emerges from one of those cells, that's when she's going to go out on her nuptial flights. Somebody asked, Barbara asked, is the queen the biggest of the three? Yes, the queen is the biggest one here. You can also see the queen with the red mark on her back here. And it's, you can see the queen isn't that much bigger though. When there's one queen in 60,000 bees, and you're looking through 30 or 40 different frames looking for that one queen, sometimes the best way to identify her, if she's not marked like this, is by the retinue of worker bees that are all facing her. Wherever she walks, you'll see workers will turn to touch her with their antennae, and that's to pick up her pheromone and tell everybody else, hey, everything's copacetic here. So that's oftentimes I spot the queen based on how the workers are reacting to her. But marking a queen is valuable both for being able to spot her and also for being able to track how old she is. We have an international queen marking system, so every 5 years, our color change, or every year our color changes. There's 5 different colors that we use throughout the season. So that's, a little bit higher level. Going on to the next slide. So this is just, I want to talk about simple anatomy, and this is something we go much more in depth into into the beekeeping course. But the main thing I want you to see here is that a honeybee, like many insects, is divided up into 3 sections. The head, which is where the eyes, the mandibles, and the antennae are. And then the thorax, which is the midsection, which if you look at it, this is essentially just the muscle section. All the legs are attached to the thorax and the wings are attached to the thorax. And the thorax is really all muscle. All the organs are in the abdomen, all the really important bits, especially if you're actually picking up a queen to mark her. That's why you would only touch the thorax. That's pure muscle, and even the heart is a dorsal heart, is in her abdomen. So here in the abdomen, we have the honey crop, which is where a worker bee will ingest nectar, and she starts adding enzymes to it, and then that's how she'll carry it. She ingests the nectar from a flower, carries it back to the hive in this honey crop, and then regurgitates it with those enzymes in it to start the process of it changing into honey, breaking it down into more simple sugars. And then we also have the stinger and the wax glands on the abdomen. Barbara also asked, how do you mark a queen? Well, usually if you're buying a package or a nucleus colony, I would say in your first year, don't mark your own queens. Ask the person who you're buying from if they sell marked queens, and if not, could they potentially mark the queen before selling it to you. Most package bees come with marked queens in them, but I pick them up, and usually I'll pick them up by their wings, and I hold their thorax between my thumb and index finger, and I touch my fingers together with a paint marker. I just use a regular paint marker that I bought from an art store, and just do a dab of paint in the center of the thorax. And really, I'm very careful to never touch the abdomen or the head for the reasons I already explained. So the beeswax in the hive, how do the bees make beeswax? Well, if you actually look on the underside of a worker bee, you'll see 8 little scales. Each one of those scales is actually a wax gland, and they produce these little white flakes of wax. And when, if you put frames in that didn't have any foundation, or if you're keeping a top bar hive, or out in nature, if they were just drawing their own comb out in a tree hollow, they would hang off of each other like you see on the picture on the right. That's called festooning. And what they're doing is they're using gravity to slowly draw out their comb, and they're chewing up these little white flakes of wax. They use their feet to pass it up to their mandibles, and they chew it up, and they make this perfectly hexagonal comb. And it's so perfectly sized and symmetrical that generally, if you hold up a frame to the light and you look at the center of one of those hexagons, one of those cells, you'll see a perfect little Mercedes-Benz symbol in the center of that. And what that actually is the cells, the corner of the cells on the other side of that comb. So that shows how perfectly symmetrical it is throughout, and what amazing architects honeybees are. So the other element we mentioned, and we were talking about what's in the hive, is brood. So worker bee brood, the whole cycle starts with the queen laying an egg. And that egg it's a teeny tiny egg, and that's one of the skills you'll learn as a beekeeper, is being able to spot eggs. Right? If you take the class we teach, we really make sure that even if we have to get a magnifying glass out, we want to make sure everybody before the end of the class gets to see worker eggs and is able to recognize worker eggs, because that's really essential to being able to recognize if you have a good laying queen. So a worker bee will, or I'm sorry, a queen bee will lay an egg right in the center of the cells, right in the center of that Mercedes-Benz symbol I just mentioned. And then that teeny tiny egg will hatch out into a really teeny tiny larvae, even smaller than that egg, after 3 days. And then that larvae is the growth period for the bee. It goes from being almost, too small for the naked eye to see larvae to filling the entire cell, to a pre-pupa, which fills up the whole cell. That is a 5.5 day period, 5 to 6 days generally for the larvae. And then that larvae has actually silk glands in her mouth parts, as well as the worker bees have silk glands in their mandibles. So the nurse bees will help her to make a little capping on top of her larvae, and she'll make it herself. And that's the pupal period is the metamorphosis phase. So that's when it'll go from looking like a little larvae to looking like a bee. So that's a 12 to 13 day period. So from that queen laying the egg on day 1, it's 21 days until an adult bee will emerge and go right to work as a cleaning bee, and eventually become a nurse bee, and so on and so on. John asked a perfect what? I'm sorry, I forgot what I said was perfect. Perfect hexagon probably is what I said, but I'm probably forgetting. So sorry, John. Mercedes-Benz symbol. Yeah, so that Mercedes-Benz symbol shows you, that's what you see. If you look down into a single one of these cells, you'll see what looks like a Mercedes-Benz, like the hood ornament on a Mercedes-Benz. So it's like a peace sign without the center line. So that actually, if you look in the very center of that Mercedes-Benz symbol where the 3 lines meet, that's usually where you can spot a worker's egg, or the egg that the queen has laid. So that's a really broad overview, and believe me, we go much more in depth in our 10-part class. Every class has a different topic that we focus on. We spend about 20 to 30 minutes doing a PowerPoint presentation, and then we go out to the hives and try and see those things we learned about in the hives each day. I wanted to leave you with one parting thought about bees, and I don't know how many of you have ever seen this before. What's behind me? This is a bee swarm. Like I said before, when they, well, I don't think I actually mentioned this before. When a hive gets too full and there's no more space for the queen to lay eggs anymore, she'll start making a queen cell. She'll lay an egg in a cell that's pointing straight down in the hive, and that's a sign to everybody else, hey, it's time to swarm. So they'll produce new queens, and just before that new queen emerges, the old queen's going to take off and leave the hive for the new queen, whoever emerges first, to take over. And about 40% of the hive goes with her. The majority of the older bees go with the queen, and they will cluster together, usually in a tree about 1 to 2 stone throws away from where the mother hive was, where the original hive was. They're going to cluster together and protect the queen while they send out scouts to find a new place to live. So if they find the perfect tree hollow, it's the right volume and it's the right size entrance, that's a perfect new home, they're gonna come back and they're do a little waggle dance. So basically what they're doing is they're doing a figure 8 right on top of this bivouac, this cluster of bees. They're walking around in a figure 8 symbol, and on one of those passes, they're going to be waggling their backside. That waggle phase, when they're going at a certain angle, the angle in relation to straight up and down vertical is the same angle from the sun to that new home. And that could be up to 3 miles away. And the distance that they're doing that waggle phase in, whether it's 3 seconds of waggling or 5 seconds of waggling, is in correlation to the distance. So they're giving directions to these other bees, up to 3 miles away. They can find, this oak hollow that's, like 2.5, 3 miles away. And those other bees are going to go and they're going to check that out. And if they like that same spot, they're going to go back and they're going to do the same dance. So if they're if they really like that source or that new home, they're going to do that dance. But let's say they find another hollow that they like better, they'll do a different dance. And basically, what they're doing here is voting. They won't break cluster until they're all doing the same dance. Once they're all doing the same dance, then you'll see this whole cluster of bees. And that can be within 2 hours, or that can be 2 days before they break cluster and go to the new source. But once you see them all doing that same waggle dance, and I've seen it before, I've actually gone to catch a swarm. This is what I'm doing in this picture here. I set up some boxes underneath them, and then I put a box that has frames in it with the bottom board, and I just touch the bees to it, and I snip off that branch so that they're acclimated to it, and I gently cover them up. And then once they've settled into the hive, I'll move them to where I want the hive. But I've also done it where I've reached for that branch and I see they're all doing the same waggle dance, and I say, oh man, I better hurry. And before I can even snip the branch, the whole cluster fizzles off and goes as one giant cloud all the way across our pastures and over and towards Great Mountain Forest to never be seen again, which was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life. It was a beautiful thing to see. It was disappointing because I lost the swarm, but at the same time, it was worth it just to see them all flying as one giant force. But I wanted to leave you with that. Dr. Tom Seeley from Cornell wrote a book called Honeybee Democracy, which is all about this amazing and fascinating bee behavior and communication in the hive. And I wanted to leave you with that because like I said before, the more you learn about honeybees, the more fascinating they become, and the more addicting it becomes. The more I've been keeping bees now for going on 14 years, 15 years actually, and every year I learn new things. So I hope you'll take this on and fall in love with it the way that I have. And with that, I'll open it up to some more questions if people want to add more questions to the chat, or if you can also unmute yourself if you have questions. I know I did go quite a bit over on time, so I apologize, Megan. So anybody have more questions here? I think I answered all the questions that were in the chat. Meg, did you happen to see any questions that I missed by chance? Nope.
I don't think so.
I think you've got them all.
We got one from Roxanne Whitaker. So much about the bees that visit, and what should I plant that they love? That's a great question, Roxanne. I'm a big fan of cover crops. So, if you have a garden and you have pathways in that garden, or you can even plant like Dutch white clover in the in-between spaces in your garden, that's wonderful. I I also say to people, maybe try and mow your lawn a little less often so that you can let the dandelions and clovers bloom for a little bit longer. Dandelions aren't a bad thing. That's one of the best nectar sources for bees. Buckwheat is also a wonderful cover crop for the farmers out there or other people that have gardens that would like to plant cover crops in their gardens. Buckwheat does really it grows most times throughout the growing season. It's very fast growing. Makes really beautiful dark ambery honey. Some people don't like buckwheat honey as much because it's a little stronger in flavor, but I adore it. I think it's really delicious. What type of paint do you recommend for painting beehives? That's the low VOCs is best. I buy just a low VOC, non-toxic paint from Benjamin Moore, just at Lindell's here in town. But also some people will take the propolis from the hives and mix that with oh shoot, forgetting the type of oil. Like a more non-toxic lacquer as well, and use that to paint their hives. But I also try and use a variety of different colors. I know my apiary might be a little too colorful for some people's taste, but having a variety of different colors, especially pastels. I avoid red because red's out of the spectrum of colors that you see. That red looks black to them. But pinks and purples, yellows, and blues and blue-green, because that having that contrast helps them. If I have multiple hives, they can identify their hive a little better amongst other hives. How much time do you need per week to maintain them? So I want honeybees for their pollination. It depends on the time of year. When you first install your bees, I would check on them every 10 to 14 days. Well, 10 to 14 days ideally. I mean, I don't think you would do any harm if you're checking every week. Every 7 days would be great. And per hive, in the initial years, you're probably looking at more like 15 minutes. Well, actually, probably closer to a half an hour in the beginning. But you should get to the point where you're not spending more than 2 minutes in a hive. As you get more comfortable, you don't want to have your hives open for a long time. So if I'm working my own apiary and I'm not teaching, I usually won't spend more than 2 minutes per hive unless I'm doing something very complicated or like I need to find the queen for a specific reason. So bank on an hour once every week to 10 days. And then when you get to the 4th of July and beyond, it could be more like every 2 to 3 weeks you're checking your hives. And then when you get back to the fall, because they're not producing as much nectar in that dearth period. You get back to September, you're getting back towards every 10 days or so. About how much honey, quartz pounds can you expect to harvest from open of your hives? Well, pounds, I would say in the first year, keep your expectations low. You may just produce enough honey just for them to survive, and you may even need to feed sugar syrup in the fall to make sure that they get through the winter just fine. That first year, they're really drawing out a lot of their comb. But I had somebody that I helped with their beehives this last year. And he had 2 beehives in his first year. He got 100 pounds. Don't expect that from 2 hives. And most of it came from 1 hive. And that was 2 separate harvests. We harvested once around mid-July, and then we harvest it again in September. But you know, it all depends on the nectar flow and the year, so that can vary quite a lot. I also had another client, or another person I was helping with their hives last year, that got zero honey, and they just had one hive, but they got zero honey in that first year, and we ended up feeding sugar syrup. And you know, just it's a luck of the draw to a certain extent. For gardeners who may not have bees but want to support all pollinators, please search for the Pollinator Pathway and Aspetuck Land Trust here in Connecticut. Awesome, thank you for tons of ideas and plant sales to discover native pollinator plants. That's wonderful, yeah. And you know, bear in mind, not just annuals, you know, think about the different perennials that you can plant and trees that you can plant for nectar and pollen sources. Any recommendations about local specific resources for getting familiar about the timing of pollen and nectar flows in the New York City metro region? There are some national nectar maps, but I am on the search for maps, calendars, and rules of thumb for Hudson Valley, Southwestern Connecticut, New York City, Northern New Jersey. Well, one I would recommend is join the Backyard Beekeepers Association of Connecticut, which is in Southern Connecticut, because they have a Facebook group, and I oftentimes know what's blooming in Southern Connecticut even before it blooms here in Northern Connecticut, because people are posting all the time. You know, that's literally every nectar or pollen source they see bees on, you know, you'll see just a post come through that says bees on linden, bees on black locust, you know, bees on in the early spring willow, and things like that. Other than that, nothing great is coming to mind for good nectar maps for our region. Maybe Tom might have something there. He's in New York City. Are raccoons or foxes, etc., besides bears, problems for hives? Really, the only thing I can think of that's a problem, aside from, well, two things. Mice or voles in the wintertime want to go into your hive and make a nest inside your hive, and so you need to put some sort of mouse guard. I just use half-inch box wire or half-inch hardware cloth, and I put that over all my entrances to keep mice from going into my hive. And the other thing is skunks. Skunks will come and they'll scratch at the entrance of the hive, and then when a guard bee comes out, they come at night, and they'll eat those guard bees. And the best way to deal with skunks is to raise up your hive. You know, having that hive stand is the best thing. You know, even if you just put them on a couple cinder blocks, that's high enough that the skunk is going to have to climb up a little bit, and that exposes their soft underbelly. So when those guard bees come out, they're going to sting them where it hurts most, and the skunk will quickly get sick of it. Never heard of foxes or raccoons really being an issue in beehives, but you know, there's plenty of things that I haven't heard about. When would you put a second deep on after installing a package? If you have a 10-frame hive, when 6 of those frames are drawn out and either have honey, pollen, or brood in them, go ahead and add another box. So it depends on the nectar flows. It's not really something, you know, I can't tell you it's going to be in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It really just depends on how your nectar flow is doing. Great. I think that's everything. Do we have any other questions? Well, I really want to thank everybody for your attention, and and point you again to the David M. Hunt Library. And thanks again, Meg, for giving me this space to talk to so many folks. It's a wonderful library, and it's a great place to support with donations. And I also have to remind you to check out our website, beavertidesfarm.com, and if you're interested in our bee class, we would love to. We have a few more spots left. We'd love to have you in our class.
Thank you so much, Dan, on behalf of the library. I really appreciate you doing this, and thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Meg, for hosting, and everybody check out the beekeeping classes.
Awesome.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everybody.
All
Have
right.
a nice afternoon.
All right.